So hello, everybody, and welcome to Diversity in Aquatics again. It's been a while since we've done a show, but I think it's going to be worth the wait because this time I'm really excited to have two great people to talk about Indigenous water safety models, both in New Zealand and in Canada. So we have Chanel Phillips here, and we have Audrey Giles. And I'll let them both do their own self-introduction so you can meet them and we'll go from there. So can we start with Chanel, please?
Awesome. Tēnā koe ku. Ngā mihi ki a koutou, ko waio, ko motatau te maunga, ko taikino te awa, ko ngā toki matawhaurua te waka, ko ngā puhi te iwi, ko ngā tihine te hapu. No te taitoke rawa hau, no Aotearoa hau. Ko Chanel Phillips tōku ingoa, no reira tēnā koutou katoa. So kia ora everybody, my name is Chanel Phillips. I whakapapa or my genealogical connections to the far north of Aotearoa, New Zealand. My tribes are Ngāti Hine and Ngāpuhi, and I'm a lecturer down in Dunedin at the School of Physical Education, Sport and Exercise Sciences at the University of Otago, and I'm really excited for our kōrero today. Kia ora.
Cool. And Audrey, please.
Yeah, so I'm Audrey Giles. I'm a professor in the School of Human Kinetics at the University of Ottawa. I am of English and Welsh descent, and I live, work, and learn on the unceded territories of the Odawa Anishinaabe.
Great. So the whole point of this is partly to obviously share information, but also for Audrey and Chanel to have a catch up and have a chat. So you'll see me stepping back every now and then and letting them talk, as well as stepping in every now and then. My perspective, obviously, is one of a learner. So I'm really interested in learning from both of you as we go forward. So probably to start out from the perspective, so we have the New Zealand perspective and we have a Canadian perspective as well. Maybe start with the New Zealand perspective because the Wai Puna model, which you have proposed, Chanel, is now part of the National Water Safety Strategy leading up to 2025. So maybe giving your impression of what the Wai Puna model is and a little bit about the background so we get a feeling for what it's about, really.
Awesome. So I did my PhD, when did I start? 2015, and I submitted in 2018. And my PhD was really looking at Māori perspectives of water safety in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Very little sort of published research and literature existed around Indigenous perspectives to water safety, and specifically Māori as well for New Zealand. And so that was really what I was looking at in my research, was we have a very high drowning rate for Māori. We're about 15% of New Zealand's population, and we were accounting for about 23% of our national drowning statistics each year. And I believe the worst year was about 26%. So we had a high overrepresentation of Māori drowning. But for me, being Ngāti Hine Ngāpuhi, we have a sort of deep, inherent, intimate and spiritual connection to water. And so I was really interested into understanding why we have these high drowning rates despite this cultural connection to water. And so very much my research began about looking at that connection we as Indigenous people have to water. And so Wai Puna was one of the key findings from my doctoral research. And effectively, it's a model that conceptualizes water safety from a Māori lens. Many of our hapu, iwi, our subtribes and tribes can resonate with the key pillars of Wai Puna and see how it's important for each of those hapu and each of those iwi. So Wai Puna is grounded foremost on strengthening our connection as Māori to water. And we do that through three key pillars. So that's whakapapa, which is our genealogy, our genealogical connection to water, which is often told through our traditional creation stories. The next pillar was the mātauranga. So that's our traditional Māori knowledge or ways of knowing, Māori derived ways of knowing. And then the last aspect was tikanga. So that's our practices and our protocols, how we engage with the water as Māori. And so Wai Puna was really how we understand water safety, but fundamentally our connection as Māori to the water. For Māori, we ask two fundamental questions, ko wai koe, no wai koe, or nā wai koe, which on the surface level is asking who are you and where are you from? And wai is our word for water in Māori. And so it's actually asking what waters are you and from where do your waters flow? So from the very outset, how we identify ourselves and share our identity with others is actually through water. And when we come to answer those questions, we'd answer ko Chanel o. And o is our word for flow or current. So even the way we answer those questions, again, is our relation or shows our relationship to water. So that's really the essence, I think, behind the Wai Puna model, how we go about strengthening connection to water, because the natural byproduct of that strengthened connection is better water safety outcomes and is better health outcomes as well. And so it's quite a holistic way of looking at water safety. It's also fundamentally around health and well-being, because we as Māori know that water is fundamental to our health in the same respect that the environment is. And so that's also encapsulated in Wai Puna. And I can share a little bit later on as well about how the Wai Puna model was formed through a kōrero that was gifted to me by my kuia, so from my auntie, Rangi Davis as well. So I can share that a little bit later on, because I'm keen to hear about what Audrey's been up to too. So hopefully that answers your question, Kurt.
No, absolutely. And I'm loving this, because the sharing here is what we're looking for. So Audrey, I think I'll hand it over to you. Maybe give a little bit of impression about what you just heard and how that might resonate with what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really blown away. It's amazing. And I love how it's being taken up at the national level. We don't have anything like that in Canada. I think, there's now a bit of an acceptance that we need to do work with Indigenous communities. It seems like in the past, the solution to the problem of high rates of drowning in Indigenous communities was to just give more of the same program, as opposed to fundamentally saying, is there something wrong with this program? And when I would, say, I think there's something wrong here, people would say, well, it's too expensive and there's too few people to do things in rural and remote communities that have the highest rate. But I've kind of, I think, kept plugging away there. But the geography of Canada is vast. And so we have, just such huge differences. I do most of my research in the north, and there are 3 territories kind of right across the top of Canada, and the one in the middle is the Northwest Territories, and there are 11 official languages. So that tells you a little bit about the diversity. And so you have people, so you have Inuit who are up on the coast, who are, people of the Arctic. And then you have people who are more inland, who are in the boreal forest. So huge cultural differences, huge geographical differences. And so kind of, having this a singular national approach, I think it is really challenging for a country the size of Canada, with the diversity that we have of Indigenous peoples with, completely different language groups, for instance. But I think just that appreciation that there is the need for inclusion of Indigenous knowledge is really powerful. And that should certainly be informing what is being done on regional and provincial and territorial levels, but it doesn't really seem to be. I think, one of the big sticking points, I think, is people are now aware that Indigenous people should be involved in decision making, which sounds like, surprising. I can't believe people hadn't thought of that before. But Indigenous organizations are really overburdened with requests and underfunded. And, drowning isn't necessarily their biggest issue. having water that they can drink might be a bigger issue. Having adequate access to healthcare might be a bigger issue. So I think the constraints of colonialism are really what limit what can be possible when you're if a First Nation, Inuit group, Métis group is so busy trying to get access to the basic things that are needed to have the social determinants of health at any sort of acceptable level, then it becomes difficult to really dive into some of these other issues, I think. New Zealand has always been a leader, I think, like New Zealand, Australia, in terms of water safety. And I also think that one of the things that's really interesting with New Zealand and Australia is that on coroner's reports, you record ethnicity. We don't do that in Canada. And so the rates that we have for drowning, I'm laughing because it's laughable the way they're determined. Basically, people look at the person who's drowned last name and where they drowned, and they make their best guess as to whether or not that person was Indigenous.
Oh dear.
So I see Kurt just saying, what? So that's really, a major limiter for our understanding of what is going on with drowning in this country. So I think we have so much to learn from countries that are like light years ahead of us, like Maori.
Cool. Chanel, anything to add to that one?
Yeah, I mean, it's so, yes, it's very true. It's incredibly sad to hear. And I mean, even reading through all the literature and things, understanding in New Zealand, we definitely for Māori, as Audrey was saying, so far ahead in terms of Indigenous acceptance and sort of having that at that national level now with this Wai Puna Model. And I know as Māori, we still have so much more to do, and we still have so much, we still have to go so much further. And so to know that other Indigenous groups are even further behind than that, it is something that's really hard to hear, because we know that there's still a lot more work we need to be doing even in our own country for our Indigenous people. I think it was something you wrote, Audrey, in one of your papers around this issue of drowning and how it ends up being quite victim blaming. And so when you have these higher rates in Indigenous populations, it's almost like this this dialogue around victim blaming within our Indigenous communities as well. And so there's always these negative assumptions that get made, and then these assumptions then become, not stereotypes, but they almost become the norm. And so that's
absolutely.
Yeah, and that's what I definitely try to advocate against, I suppose. And really, when we're looking at drowning prevention for Aotearoa Māori context, we really look at it from the strength-based approach. So drowning prevention and water safety is almost like a byproduct of the strengthened connection, because that is effectively how we go about strengthening our identity as Māori. And even in terms of the word Māori, like that's even sometimes contentious in New Zealand, because we are actually of our iwi and our hapu identities, so Ngāti Hine and Ngāpuhi. So while we do, I guess on this broader international level, have this one homogenous identity, we actually very much have our own diverse hapu and iwi sort of groupings as well. And that's what I love, I think, about the Wai Puna model, is that it allows the uniqueness of those iwi and those hapu to come through. And so currently, water safety project I'm involved in, we're working with 3 different sort of, I guess, hapu iwi across New Zealand, in Otago, Waikato, and in Northland. And so we're able to see, or we're starting to see those uniqueness, the uniqueness of each hapu that we're working with, and how they come to identify, or I guess define what Wai Puna actually looks like for them in terms of whakapapa, mātauranga, and tikanga. And I think sharing that diversity is what is actually the biggest strength as well for us. And it's sort of just adding all of those layers. And that sort of shared approach is that connection to water, which we all know that we share.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think in Canada, the Canadian Red Cross is one of the biggest organizations that offers swimming lessons, like with the Life Saving Society as well. And my grad student, Kyle Rich, and I worked on creating a cultural safety module within the Canadian Red Cross water safety instructor program. And I mean, that's probably the biggest thing I will ever do in my career, right? You have 1 million children each year taking swimming lessons that have been taught by somebody who hopefully had this as part of their training program. So trying to sensitize, especially white folk to the fact that you actually do have culture. And yes, colonialism is a thing. And also, certainly Indigenous peoples are not the only consideration that we need to make too. Right? We have, Canada is a hugely multicultural country. We need to consider all sorts of groups, but certainly there are special considerations, I think, for Indigenous groups that need to be made. So, I mean, I think kind of on the national level, that's the only thing that has been done other than a lot of kind of collective hand wringing and being like, how do we do this? We should really do this more. Oh, but they're too busy to meet with us. Oh, so we'll just wait, right? As opposed to saying, okay, let's put like time and resources into this. Let's hire somebody who can really drive this agenda forward. So I do think there's been greater sensitivity in the Canadian context, especially kind of post Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but none of the calls to action were around water safety, right? You have some, definitely around sport, healthcare, education, but I think that there's some good teachings for Canadians from that about, mandating that Indigenous peoples are at the table and showing the harms that have been done by colonialism. And I think Canadians are still very much in a learning phase about that. And again, I think New Zealand is quite far ahead in that way, though of course it's not painting it as a utopia, because I know that it's not. But I mean, even just in terms of getting a basic knowledge within the education system, like I'm sure Kurt and I learned nothing in high school about Indigenous people except maybe a small role that they played in the War of 1812.
Half a page in a textbook.
Yeah.
Although we did have some novels that we read that were highlighted a bit, but definitely not at the level that I would have liked to see.
Yeah. So it's fairly amazing when students come to my class now, and now they know what residential schools were. And so you were saying, Chanel, about how the way stereotypes play themselves out. When I say that I work with Indigenous communities around drowning, number one thing, how many of them were drunk is the question that I get. Number two, how many of those were suicides? Right? And so you see the way in which this deficit-based, deeply racist approach permeates people's thinking around this issue. And so it's not like, oh, we need to change water safety. It's they need to change their singular behavior, right? And so really trying to unpack that through the social determinants of health is something that I have found quite useful, because we know that if you're poor, you're more likely to drown. We know if you have less education, you're also more likely to drown. We know if you have poor access to healthcare, you're also more likely to drown. And so, a lot of my questions are not, okay, why are drowning rates so high, but actually, why aren't they higher? I'm actually fundamentally surprised at the fact that drowning rates aren't higher. And I think that speaks to Indigenous people's knowledge of the land and their waters and their ability to stay safe in spite of really enormous barriers.
Yeah, and I love what you've said there, Audrey, because that's effectively what it is. trying to unpack what the strengths within our Indigenous communities are. Quite often when we're looking at issues within our Indigenous populations, we have the answers. It's just that time and resources given to our communities so that we can then work alongside our, whether they're researchers, practitioners, academics, what have you, to come up with those solutions. But I think that's one of the key things is when I was doing my research, it was effectively just talking to our kaumātua kuia, so our elders within those communities I was working with, and asking them what did they think the issue was and what would they do about it in terms of solving these issues. And it was always coming back to we need to strengthen not only the resilience, but we need to strengthen the identity of our young people so that they know culturally who they are. Because if you don't know who you are and where you come from, that's something that has wider impacts later on in life as well. And so just understanding that idea, or that simple idea that Indigenous people have the solutions, it's just, you're right, they're not at the table to be heard and to make those changes within their communities.
Yeah, and my two favorite examples of that, which I trot out in so many papers, the example in Alaska, and I wish this were my research, but it wasn't, when there were lots of drownings happening on the Yukon River because this community was on the Yukon River and people used it all the time for travel. But when people went missing on the river, everything in the community shut down. I'm not sure if this is the case in Maori communities, but in Indigenous communities in Canada, if there's a funeral, school stops, businesses stop, everyone kind of goes to the funeral. If someone's missing, everything stops again. Everyone's out looking. And so, well, this is an American example, actually. But so in this Indigenous Alaska community, when people went missing, everybody was searching for them or for the body. And so they asked the elders to come up with the intervention, and the intervention that the elders came up with was twofold. One, they asked for float coats, so the top half of a survival suit, to be sold at the local store at cost, but just as a kind of a lightweight boating jacket. And then they came up with a message of wear your float coat, so if you drown, we won't have to drag the river for your body. And it cut drownings by 50%, saved millions of dollars every year in search and rescue. And I never would have come up with that message. I would have thought, like, I first of all, it wouldn't have crossed my mind. Second of all, I'd be like, that's pretty grim, right? Kind of fatalistic. But at the same time, it's from the elders and it worked. And when people finally asked the elders what would work, they knew. And, to me, the power in that message is so often in Western societies, it's very individualistic. And it's like, don't drown because it's bad for you. Where this message was, don't drown because it's bad for everybody else, right? And I think that is really, really powerful. The other one that I really love was, again, in Alaska, they had whalers who didn't want to wear survival suits because they're bright orange or red. And in their belief system, that would scare off the whales. And so if you're a whaler, that's not what you want to happen. And so the Office for Boating Safety in Alaska, along with the Alaska Tribal Council, I think it was, worked with Mustang Survival, and they came up with float coats that were white so that they blended in with, the snow and the ice. And then they're like, yeah, sure, I'll wear this, right? So the problem isn't that, it's lack of education. These, people don't know what's good for them. It's nobody asked them what would work for them. And when they finally did, they were able to come up with a solution themselves. So, again, very effective. And it's just, it's almost comical at this point that people don't think to stop and ask people what they'd like. And that, community-based approaches are still really novel. When I'm talking to my students, I'll always say, you are, that you're much more likely to participate in something when you've had your voice heard and you think that it reflects your needs. This is kind of, I think, a truism everywhere. So I think that one of the most important things that we can do as people involved in health promotion is just shut up. And I think, like, white folk from the South are particularly bad at doing that because we're so oh, we need to fill this conversation, as opposed to being comfortable with silence, sitting and waiting for a person to speak when they think it is appropriate. And yeah, if we did a lot more shutting up and listening, I think we would be a lot more successful in the Canadian context.
I really like what you said there, Audrey, around that collective approach, you know, in terms of what the elders were sharing. You know, this is something that the wider community will benefit from. And it was sort of just a real basic way of looking at it. But I was thinking the same thing, quite grim. I never would have thought of that concept. But I think that collective approach, because I know you wrote a paper recently around a collective approach to swimming education, and particularly around educating family groups as opposed to just the children or just the adults. And I think that speaks to the same idea and notion of, particularly within our Indigenous communities, we don't ever see ourselves as an individual alone. We are of a whānau unit. And we, in many of our words and many of our words within Te Reo always speaks to that wider collective unit. And so even when we're looking at water safety education in an Aotearoa context, that's sort of the next step that we're looking at, is when we're looking at teaching these sort of aquatic skills, water competencies, we're wanting to look at it not only in open water environments, because very little has been done in that area, but actually also within Māori families, the wider whānau, and how the dynamics within the whānau are actually important for that sort of water safety, swim education as well. And so that's sort of what I was thinking about when you were talking just about the elders' experience.
Yeah, and I think, there's some really interesting ways of looking at, I think, this notion of family too. So I just had a paper come out in the last week where we looked at messaging for men in water safety, and how so often it's about don't die because this is bad for your family, right? And so Australia has a campaign, Wrap Dad in a Life Jacket. So it's a Father's Day campaign that they have with basically trying to say get Dad a life jacket for Father's Day, but also saying, look, okay, well, what about the men who are not fathers, right? What about men who are queer? Like, in what ways are we limiting it when we're talking about family and how we understand family, right? Like, family doesn't have to be this heterosexual nucleus. It can be other things. And saying, men's lives are important, whether or not they're fathers. But I do think there's some interesting work about how, well, women, are men who are married live longer, right? And there seems to be something about a female partner nagging the husband, is kind of how it's set up, to go to the doctor, wear a life jacket, engage in these behaviors. And so, how do we, I think something that I've been trying to think through is, how do we have messages where, yes, okay, we realize that fathers can play very important roles in families, but also just not limiting it just to that too. Especially if I think about, kind of young men in their 20s. A lot of the stuff that I've seen around that is, don't let something happen to your mate, seems to be how they talk about that. But what are ways that we can say to, particularly Indigenous young men, that you as an entity are valuable, and it's not just because you're a father or a husband, but at the same time appreciating that those roles are important. So I think we need to take a broader approach, right, than just the father as protector approach. And I think that can be that. I think that approach can be very effective, but it can't be our only tool.
I almost don't even want to jump in now. This is awesome. And there's so much coming out with all of this, and I'm enjoying every minute of it. I wanted to jump back a little bit and touch on a couple of things from my perspective, because we're talking about these models from my perspective in New Zealand being new to New Zealand. We were talking about New Zealand being quite far ahead, which I think it is in many ways. I was very surprised about the application of those things on the ground, as far as people understanding traditions, culture, and specifically a Māori framework and way of thinking. There's not as much crossover as I thought there would be, given how much it is in the forefront, it seems, from externally. So both my children are Māori, or my stepchildren are Māori. So I came into this, I think I have a slightly different perspective than the average immigrant who would come in, who would not be within that framework. And I'm constantly surprised that there isn't more engagement and more acknowledgement. And even in meetings that I go to, where sometimes it seems to be accepted and sometimes it's just completely ignored. And there's no middle space, if you know what I mean. But one thing I want, because both of you are from the physical side in your studies, sports, as far as instructors, because that's one big thing, and I think is actually missing in New Zealand, is building in the understanding and the framework for inclusion, and specifically for the Wai Puna model, and training instructors on how this is going to look. And one of the things I've noticed, because my aquatics comes from underwater, so I'm a scuba diver, sailor, I'm all those things. Flip turns were not my forte because you can't flip turn in the ocean. So I wasn't really interested in competitive swimming. I've learned that later on and become a swimming instructor. But what I've noticed here, anytime I'm dealing with Māori youth in the pool, and this is anecdotal completely, on the surface, it may seem like they're not strong. As soon as their head goes underwater, they're fish. I recently did a program called Beach Experience with the surf lifesavers down in Whakatane. And a lot of the kids aren't that strong in the ocean and in the surf, and they just went for it. And they were in, and they were underwater. There's an aquatic ability that seems to be very strong, but it doesn't look like your typical model of swimming. And I resonate really closely with that because I didn't learn that way. So how do we look at the actual, because everything is based on the competitive swimming model quite often. And I know there is work to get away from that. The Starfish program that I work with in the United States has actually adapted that, and they take a different approach now. But how do we get away from that competitive swimming model as the pinnacle standard and start thinking about capitalizing on the abilities of the individual in the water?
No, that's a really great question, Kurt. And I think one of the things that I was thinking about when you were talking was one, I mean, again, I'm an academic, so of course I'm going to say this. I think research is a massive help and support in terms of getting our Indigenous approaches out there. How it then gets implemented into policy is sort of like another level. And while I've been, I guess, successful in terms of Wai Puna within the sector strategy, you know, we already know that there's still going to be a lot of sort of teething as how that actually gets implemented, how that's actually applied in practice, and what that actually looks like across the entire sector. So not to say that, you know, have those rose-tinted glasses on, that it is all good and well, because we know that there's still a lot of work to be done. But the biggest thing that I had, particularly around swim education, so I don't have a swim teaching background at all. My background was solely research, and particularly kaupapa Māori research. And while I have my own connection as a Māori woman to the water, a lot of my experience and expertise comes from that upbringing. So I wouldn't say I've got formal education around swim education. So quite often I tend to, one, not really know the answers in terms of that space because it's not a context I'm familiar with, but I know that there are many others that are. And so we're very lucky we have a young PhD student, Tirina Rareti, who actually came from a competitive swimming background, and she's actually looking at what does swimming look like from a Māori perspective. Is it actually different? Is it an individual approach, or is it actually looking at that wider whānau collective unit? Is it in a pool, or actually is it out in the rivers, out in the lakes, in our open water environments? And what does that mean in terms of how we define swimming within Māori contexts? So I will say that there's some research getting done now in that space, which is really exciting. And then I guess it's that same sort of process is how we go about implementing or putting into practice some of that research, and then trying to find ways that we can support our practitioners around those views. So yeah, the short answer, I don't have the answer. However, we do have some amazing students coming through that are actually looking specifically at that, because I know it's important. And I mean, we have some other practitioners. Mark Kaimona is another one who solely is swim teaching, swim education from a Māori lens. So quite often he teaches through specific strokes and how they relate to, I guess, different kaitiaki or our guardians. And so he sort of makes that connection between different swim strokes and some of our oral narratives, our traditional stories. So there is, I guess, research happening in that space, but you're very much right. It's how we then go about supporting those practitioners and the ones actually training in that area.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, Kurt, and I really like what Chanel had to say about that. You know, I think when, and again, all of my work basically is in the northern context. When you look at the history of the Northwest Territories kind of above ground pool program, it was taking teenagers, basically, you know, so university students, college students who would spend a summer going up north. They would build a temporary pool, usually within a garage or a curling rink or an arena, and they teach swimming lessons. And of course, the idea was that, well, people here just don't know how to swim, right? As opposed to saying, hang on, these people have been around water since time immemorial. There's probably a pretty good chance that people know how to swim, but it's not what people, particularly white Southerners, would think of as swimming, right? So I think there's the fundamental question of what is swimming, and does it have to look a certain way? And certainly in Canada, when it was just kind of, you know, the Red Cross was the biggest dealer in water safety lessons until the Life Saving Society kind of came in. You know, it was about having pretty strokes, right? And it was about these made up ridiculous strokes too, like elementary backstroke and side stroke and things like that. And if they weren't pretty, you weren't passing. Then kind of Life Saving Society came into it, and they were like, let's go with this more of a swim to survive perspective. Doesn't really matter if it's pretty. Can you get from A to B? So I think in Canada, we've gotten a bit away from, are these really pretty strokes? And we certainly do have a competitive stream. You know, the Red Cross lessons are still there, but they've been kind of pared down to things that seem to be a bit more, I guess, reasonable would be the word I would use, maybe. But yeah, there still is really this tyranny of what swimming is and what it ought to be and what it looked like, what it needs to look like. You know, like, does it really matter if you have a beautiful bent arm when you're doing front crawl? You know, what's the goal, right?
Yeah.
And I think so often you have people like a 19-year-old version of myself who, you know, went up north to teach swimming lessons, and it was like, well, it needs to be pretty, like your knees are coming out of the water on this elementary backstroke. Of course you can't go to the next level, right? As opposed to saying, you're in a boat, you're in the Arctic Ocean, you fall out, what are you gonna do? And the reason why I couldn't take that approach was because I didn't know, right? I was the 19-year-old, 20-year-old kid who grew up in Toronto. And yet the person who has that knowledge, the elder, the hunter, the angler, can't be on the pool deck teaching, right? They don't have the certification, so they don't have the papers, as one of my participants said, to teach the young people. I think one of the coolest things one of my students did when she was doing some research in a community was that she brought all of the elders to the pool, and they'd never been to the pool, never been inside of it. And so she basically cleared out the, senior community living. It's like, come on down to the pool, check this out. And they're like, okay, now we can tell our grandchildren about this. We see why this is important. It's like, why had nobody ever done that? Why hadn't I ever done that? Right. And I think it's so hard to get out of your sense of superiority. And especially, like with lifeguarding and swimming lessons, you are trained far more than just about any other type of youth programming instructor, right? If you're running a sport day camp, the kids just have to, kick the soccer ball around. They're not doing, 40-hour courses that need to be recertified every 2 years sort of thing. So I think there is this real sense of elitism, and we know what's best because we have to get all these qualifications in ways where other people with lived experience in other sport or contexts might be more valued. So I think that, one of the things we definitely need to do is to say there is no reason why that hunter cannot be on the pool deck with the instructor, who's got the Western certifications. I think what a very interesting project that we did was, so I mentioned in the north that the pools used to be built, and then there's still, the majority of them were until recently also still seasonal pools, but they were year-round structures. But they'd be in like kind of like essentially a glorified tin can, and so you could use them in the summertime, but not much past August. But they were shallow water pools, so they're only 3 feet deep. So about a meter deep by 13 meters long. And the joke was always, we don't need a lifeguard, we need someone who's 4 feet tall. And then we finally said, what if we took this seriously? What if we said that you didn't need to know how to swim to be a lifeguard at one of these pools? Let's change the parameters here, because what would happen was you would try to train local people to become swimming instructors and lifeguards. They'd go to the regional center, they'd go into the pool, and then they'd fail because it's deep water. They didn't have the skills. And so instead we said, well, what if we had a lifeguarding certification where you never needed to know how to swim? You had to do all the other lifeguarding skills except having to swim. You wouldn't be allowed to work at a big pool, but you'd be able to work at one of these shallow water pools. Well, all of a sudden we were able to hire local people, right? So instead of saying that, it's the locals that are the problem, we were saying, no, it's the certification that's the problem. Let's change the certification.
I'm going to be contacting you both about a lot of this stuff afterwards and getting, because I've actually been thinking quite deeply about that here in New Zealand, that exact same issue, because we are rolling out a program called Water Skills for Life, which is more focused on the key life-saving side of things and getting mobility in the water, etc. And exactly that. If we're going to have somebody guarding the pool, can we have a water watcher as opposed to a lifeguard in a 3-foot pool? But you need somebody watching, and that whole idea of 100% watch while we're doing programs like this, it does not necessarily need to be a lifeguard, but teaching communities that they have to watch each other and what drowning looks like and the beginnings of how to get somebody out safely, those kind of things you can actually build in a shorter course, which actually empowers communities and spreads the knowledge of water safety as well. So that's something that really deeply, I'm actually hopefully going to talk to Water Safety New Zealand about that shortly as well, and try and get something like that going. This is all amazing stuff. I don't even know where to go back to. I guess at this point, one thing I'd like to do is bring it back to the, and I hate to use the term quote unquote mainstream, but what's happening mainly right now. What we're talking about, I'm smiling constantly, and almost everything you're saying is resonating because it's something that's there and real and needed. in what I'm doing, so where my program, Global Swim or the Global Swim project comes from is more from an inclusive model and looking at new immigrants and, for lack of a better word, different ethnic communities and getting greater involvement in aquatics, as well as inoculating individual communities to be safer in and of themselves. So from the very beginning, I was looking at this from a community-based model rather than an individual model. And that's where I thought the aquatics industry, specifically in swimming, was starting to fall down, is that they were treating everything as an individualistic thing. We are going to teach this person to survive. But at the end of the day, from a drowning toll, it's actually the person on the beach who might say something to that person, which might mitigate the risk-taking behavior. It might be grandma on the beach who's going to say, no, none of you are going in the water here. You're going down the beach to where it's safe. That those kind of things are important and real, and you need to actually promote those things as well. So I'm specifically thinking for the Wai Puna model here in New Zealand, because one of my concerns at this point is as this model starts to roll out, and because it's rolling out so big and wide, that it's very quickly going to be adopted, but the real meaning that you're expressing, Chanel, is not going to be recognized and is not going to be transferred as part of the model. Because even looking at the translations, and again, this is my ignorance, so please, I would love if you tell me about this. The words whakapapa, mataranga, and tikanga are translated in the documents, and I think it's attitudes and beliefs, knowledge, and behavior are the translations. And it seems, because I'm really big on the power of words and really getting to the depth of what a word actually means, as opposed to loose translations, especially for my time. I used to be an English language teacher as well. So working with different cultures and really digging to the root of a word, as opposed to saying, oh, this is the English translation, and then you have no idea what they're actually talking about. What do those words, are those translations really capturing what your vision of the model is?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. First and foremost is, I mean, that's the, I guess, beauty of our language, of our te reo, is an English word is never going to translate correctly, to be completely honest. And so what one word for Māori could be 20 words in English. And so I guess that's where that sort of spirit of Wai Puna would need to be in place, or probably need to be better understood. I did work closely with Water Safety New Zealand in terms of ensuring that Wai Puna was written correctly into that sector strategy, which was probably a really important step as well. But you're absolutely right, is when our Māori words get lost in translation, and then that spirit or that essence of the kaupapa, of that purpose, that vision, then gets lost. So what I'm doing is I'm part of a team, which is our Wai Puna Kaihotu leadership team. And so effectively our role is to ensure that the sector maintains the mana and integrity of Wai Puna. And so what that looks like, I don't quite know yet. I guess I'm still new in the game, so whether I'm a bit naive or just a bit optimistic, I know that when the need to advocate stronger, the need to sort of speak up when things aren't actually going the way it needs to, I'm quite comfortable to do that. And so myself and my team, that's essentially our role, is to support Water Safety New Zealand and one leading out on the sector strategy, but also sort of sitting at that sort of higher level as well to feed down. And so we're actually the ones sort of at that, I don't know if it's the top table, but we're at that sort of higher strategic level. We're actually sitting with all the CEOs of all the organisations across the sector to ensure that Wai Puna is being implemented, I guess, correctly, where we can provide support, learnings, teachings, etc. as well. because I think that's really important as well, to know everyone is on their journey and they're all on they're at a different point in their journey, all these different organizations. And so relationships and time are probably the absolute key in terms of ensuring that Wai Puna is upheld. And so that's pretty much what my role will be doing, is working with our organisations across the sector to see what support they need around Wai Puna, whether it's training, whether it's more understanding, etc. And that's something I'm quite open to doing as well, because I know the importance of this work, and it's also a model that's quite personal to me as well. I think I was saying at the start, it was actually my auntie Rangi Davis, so that's my mother's eldest sister, and she shared a kōrero or a conversation with me. We were on the road, and I just asked her what her I think I asked her, what does water mean to her? And she gave me this beautiful story about the puna. So puna is our word for wellspring or spring. And she said that she understood water through this idea of puna, through the well springs. And when you add mata to the word puna, that's the source. So that's the source of your knowledge, effectively. It's the source of all being. And so mātāpuna was then sort of aligned with the first, I think it's like a teardrop in the Wai Puna model. And so mātāpuna reflected that pillar, and that's where whakapapa came in. Because for us, our source for everything, not only water safety knowledge, but our source is whakapapa. It is our genealogy. And then she talked about the next pillar for her was tupuna. So tupuna is our word for ancestor. And quite often we always know tupuna means our ancestors, or also could be our elders as well. But tu is our word for stand. And so she actually talked about the tupuna, our ancestors, were the ones who had the mana, the authority and the integrity to stand before that mātāpuna, before that source, and gather that wisdom and gather that knowledge. And so that's why they were called tupuna, because they had that power to stand at the puna. And the tupuna, again, because it was ancestors, that's what I refer to as the ancestral knowledge or the traditional knowledge. Hence why the second ripple, the first ripple, the second aspect, reflected mātauranga, which is our traditional knowledge. And then she also talked to me about mokopuna. So mokopuna is another really common Māori word, and everyone sort of knows that it means grandchildren. But the way she explained it was moko is also our word for, it's kind of like tāmoko is a carving on your arm or your skin. Moko kauai is the carving on your chin. And so that carving was really about your identity. That's why moko and tāmoko are so important to Māori, because it is literally carving your identity onto your skin. And so the way she talked about mokopuna was that when you would stand in front of a spring, in front of a puna, you would see your reflection, but actually you were also seeing the future generation within your reflection. And that's why grandchildren were also named mokopuna. And so that's where the tikanga aspect came in, was all the things that we do in the water, our practices, our protocols, and our customs is actually about that transfer of knowledge from one generation to the next. So from the source to the ancestors and down to the mokopuna, and that sort of cycle of, I guess, of life and death, really. And so with her sharing that kōrero with me, that's effectively what, I guess, was the genesis of the Wai Puna model. So it's, yes, about strengthening our connection to water, but it's also this connection to our whānau, our family, in the broader sense of what it means for Māori. And those relationships are really important, and fundamentally that transfer of knowledge from one generation to the next. And so that's effectively how I see Wai Puna, I guess, working across the sector, is how we go about transferring that knowledge on but then also ensuring that the mana and the integrity is upheld. So I hope that answers your question, Kurt.
That's all awesome. I'll hand it over to Audrey to comment on that if you'd like, or whether that resonates with anything that you've seen in your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think just the importance of ensuring that knowledge is given to the next generation and the generation after that is definitely something that is really key. One of the things we hear a lot about is the way in which climate change is disrupting that knowledge. And so knowledge about, safe conditions for traveling, how to tell if ice is changing, things like that, has really been disrupted. And elders saying, like, I don't know how to help people in the same ways anymore. And so I think the Canadian Arctic context is really special in that way, and that there's a whole other level of knowledge that is being disrupted because of climate change. I mean, I imagine that you see some of that in New Zealand too. I'm not sure if people who've been in your research have talked about that much.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it even thinks, so one of our, or particularly for my whānau, we are divers, so we go out getting kaimoana seafood. And even just in terms of how diving has changed, I mean, one, we've got all the equipment now, but traditionally you never had to go as far and go as deep. And so the practice even of our mahinga kai practices, or our traditional food gathering practice, has changed over time as the climate has changed. And I think that's a really important consideration that we have to have, is how are our changing coastlines, waterways actually impacting on our ability to access water safety knowledge, but also the practice and that engagement. And certainly it's changed over time, and that also impacts on our connection over time to water. And so the work that we do is around, again, that strengthening connection, because it's trying to understand what it looks like today. And yes, it may have changed. For instance, we might not be in the water every single day like our grandparents were, for instance. We may not rely on it as heavily for food as our grandparents did. And all of those changes are now sort of impacting, and we see those in our higher drowning rates today as well. And so it's really about, yes, definitely how we go about understanding those environmental changes, and what knowledge we can draw on, and I guess that sort of traditional knowledge as well, and bring it into that contemporary context, so that we can be safe in this sort of new changing environment. But yeah, you're absolutely right, Audrey. The environment and climate change is a massive consideration for water safety, absolutely.
Yep. And just to kind of comment on the work that I'm doing from the greater inclusion, specializing in immigrant communities, et cetera, here in New Zealand, a lot of the things that we're all talking about during this, though we're talking about Indigenous models, there are many, many groups who are collective communities, I would say are collective communities, which think more in a collective rather than the individualistic, that could resonate with what we're talking about. I know from my background in the Caribbean, though we have that deep colonization thing happening, we are still more on the collective side. And the climate change that you're talking about and all these things that we're talking about resonate more for me coming from that background than I think they would from somebody coming from, and again, for lack of a better term, Eurocentric model.
Yep.
And a lot of the things that I'm seeing, so one of the reasons why I do that whole idea of the collective is very important in what I do is because of that. So they have the program here, Etufano, which is a family program originally based on a Māori framework that they are now using for immigrant communities who have collective backgrounds. as well. And they're successfully transferring a lot of that to resonate with immigrant communities coming in and strengthening family bonds in those communities. And I'm just at the beginning of understanding it and starting to look into it. But my thought is, going back to the point of how do we take these Indigenous models, how will they look when the mainstream, quote unquote, looks at it? And how will it affect everybody when they look at it from their different perspectives? And for me, the challenge is to look at the Wai Puna model and be respectful to the Wai Puna model, but take the elements of that model that would resonate with these communities that I'm working with, specifically these collective communities from different parts of the world, and really use those elements. Yeah, so don't quite know where I'm going with that, but it's just pulling it back to how do we actually, what is it going to look like when we put it out there? And how do we engage young instructors who don't know much about these communities when they engage?
I think too, even with you saying though, talking about that is a lot of, like, I'm just thinking back to Sue Mason Jerry's Te Whare Tapa Whā. So that's our model of Māori health in New Zealand. It was actually in our New Zealand health and physical education curriculum as well. And so that reflects the four sort of cornerstones of health: the physical health, spiritual, mental, and social. And so that model, very much a Māori model, and it pretty much went everywhere. It was primarily within that health sector, but then it got used in education. It's sort of out there everywhere. And so I think the beauty of our Indigenous models is that they can be applicable across disciplines, across sectors. And the way that people sort of come to understand them and apply them, and again, it goes back to that diversity. It is actually a strength, how people actually make sense of it in their own context. And so rather than looking at it from they might do it wrong, they might get it wrong, or things will be like there might be issues, it's actually looking at how we can also extend and go beyond those models. And so that's something that we were encouraged as sort of the young Māori scholars coming through university, was these models are really great. They were the foundation for, say, Māori health in New Zealand in the 80s. How do we actually extend beyond that now? What does it look like in a context today? And so that's very much what I think Wai Puna will happen, what will happen with Wai Puna in the future as well. Is, this is just the starting point in terms of a model for water safety and health from a Māori perspective. So it could grow and people might take parts of it and then develop something a bit different. And so I think that's something that's also really exciting, as opposed to, maybe looking at it a bit, that might be a bit wrong or something. It's actually, the differences could be a strength, and it's quite unique as well.
Yep. Audrey, anything to add on that one?
No, I think that's really well said. It's funny to me that we don't do much reflecting on. It seems like when there is a Eurocentric model, it's like, of course it's going to work everywhere, right? And when it's like, for instance, the Maori model, it's like, well, how do we apply it in these other contexts, right? And it's like, well, the Eurocentric model shows that that vast applicability is possible. There's probably some happy middle ground here, right? So, but yeah, it's just so funny. Like, I think how we talk about things as being very particular and very different, forgetting sometimes about the historical context of, how we live our lives now. Right, and the ways in which that has been deeply colonized too. So I think there's definitely a lot of room to move the needle there.
Absolutely.
Yep. I think for me, I am reflecting deeply on this, and I've talked to a few other Chanel that about the model and what their take on it is. I really want to understand because, like you say, you guys are going to be working from the top down. I'm going to be working from the bottom up. And being in that position, I really want to be able to have an understanding of the model so I can reflect that. And that takes some reflection and taking the time to do that reflection as opposed to just looking at what I read and going, oh, look, a model, and I'm just going to use it for what I use it for. And I so often see, and again, resonating with what I've been through with my kids and going through the school system with my kids and seeing how people react in different ways, that it's so often watered down, or during a meeting, there's recognition at the beginning of the meeting for protocol and recognizing Māori custom, and then during the meeting, it's completely ignored for the rest. And it's frustrating. So I think forgive me, I don't know whether it's my place, but I'm a little protective of the model. I don't want it to become that. I don't want it to become something that people go, oh yes, we're following this framework and we're recognizing, and now we're going to do it like we did it before. There's a chance to change something from the very beginning, and it takes a little bit of reflection and thinking about those words more deeply, and maybe not thinking about the English word, but taking the extra couple of minutes of conversation to really think about what the word actually means and using sentences to frame the deeper meaning might create some transformation within the industry. And not allowing the industry to kind of pick it up and keep going the way it's going just because it's kind of a lot of momentum. It wants to keep going the way it's going. So this might be a chance to pull brakes a bit. Sorry, West Indian term. And think about it more deeply.
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, I'm certainly definitely protective of it. However, when we did the sort of the official launch of the sector strategy, it was beautiful. And it was sort of one of those moments where you kind of have this sort of deeper sense or feeling that actually it's going to be okay. And I think it's those moments that we need to listen to as well. And so that's sort of the experience I had. And I know that I'm in that sort of, at that sort of table where I can not only continue to advocate, but I can pull up people or organizations when it isn't happening, when it isn't going the way it needs to go. And that's all part of the sort of the leadership role that we're taking to ensure that Wai Puna is actually implemented respectfully and I suppose correctly across the wider sector. And you're right, there's definitely a lot of work to do. There's lots of reflection needed in order to create that change and create that transformation. And yeah, I think it is exciting. It's a little bit tiring to think of all the work that I know is going to be coming soon. But I think the relationships that we've developed with sort of key people, and particularly within Water Safety New Zealand as well, who will be leading out on the strategy, I think those relationships are really key for me to have the confidence that it'll happen and that it'll be used appropriately. So no, I definitely hear what you're saying, Kurt.
Great. I did lose you for a little bit. My mic cut out for a sec.
Yeah, you kind of
did I warble?
Yeah, I don't even know the word. It's that.
Did that.
It's a little bit distorted, your voice.
We'll see what happens in the end. But I think we could probably keep talking for a long time. Maybe we might need to do another one if you guys are keen. But what I'd like to do now is kind of hand it over to each of you to sum up. We can close this one and then look forward to a future conversation. But I'll start with you, Audrey, if you have some things you'd like to say in closing.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's a small community that I get to geek out with over water safety in Canada. And so enlarging that to include the two of you is fantastic. And yeah, I think I'm just filled with ideas of, like, oh my God, I gotta get Chanel to talk to these people, put Kurt in touch with these people, and how do we do this? And what's the approach? What could this approach look like in Canada? So I think my overwhelming feeling is that of excitement. And yeah, that I'm really looking forward to building on this and developing strong relationships with the two of you and figuring out how we can change the world.
Awesome. And Chanel?
Yes, likewise. It's been an absolute pleasure and privilege to speak with you both today. And similarly, it was awesome to meet you finally, Audrey. I think as a young sort of academic going through PhD, and you're reading all of these great articles, and you actually get to finally meet the people in person has been awesome. Robert Storman was another one that I used a lot of his work and was able to connect with him in one of the conferences actually in Canada. And so it's just a really great opportunity when, as a student, you get to meet the professors and the lecturers and the researchers that you're reading their work. And yeah, I think just in terms of water safety for Indigenous people, it's really about that time, the resources, and building those relationships. It's about ensuring that their not only their voices but their solutions are what are used in the end. And so different ways that we can do that, but that's effectively, I guess, the tika, or the correct way of going about it with our Indigenous communities. And yeah, I think I'm rambling now, but it's been a pleasure speaking with you both. And thank you for the opportunity, Kurt, to connect ourselves up together too.
Pleasure's all mine. This is very selfish on my part. And as you can tell, I'm on my journey as well. So this is all part of me trying to understand and hopefully using it going forward. But thank you both so much for your time.